we take it for granted. The calendar we use is based on his birth. Billions of people pray to him every day. Wars have been fought, empires have fallen, and civilizations have been built all in his name. We assume, without question, that whatever else, he was son of God, prophet, or teacher. At the very least, he was a man who walked on the dust of Palestine, ate, slept, and died under Pontius Pilate. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the most famous person in human history never actually existed? What if Jesus of Nazareth is not a historical figure, but a literary invention, a ghost, created by blending ancient pagan myths with Jewish prophecy? This is not a question of theology, it is a question of history, and the evidence is far more disturbing than you might think. To begin this investigation, we must first understand the magnitude of the accusation. In academic circles, the idea that Jesus never existed is known as the Christ myth theory. For most of the last 2,000 years, simply asking this question could get you burned at the stake. Today, it gets you laughed out of university history departments. The overwhelming consensus among scholars, Christian, Jewish, and atheist alike, is that a man named Jesus did exist. However, consensus is not evidence, and the internet has given rise to a new wave of skepticism that demands hard proof. The argument for the non-existence of Jesus starts with a simple, unsettling fact. We have zero physical evidence for his life. There is no archaeological trace of him. We have no skeletal remains. We have no writings from his own hand. Jesus left no journals, no letters, no inscriptions on stone. But, you might argue, Socrates didn't write anything either. And we know he existed. That is true. But the problem with Jesus goes deeper than a lack of autobiography. The problem is the timeline of the evidence we do have. The earliest writings in the New Testament are the letters of St. Paul. Paul wrote around 50 to 60, a dear roughly 20 to 30 years after Jesus supposedly died. But here is the strange part. In all of Paul's letters, he barely mentions the earthly life of Jesus. He doesn't mention the virgin birth. He doesn't mention the miracles. He doesn't mention the parables. He doesn't mention Bethlehem or Nazareth. Paul's Jesus is almost entirely a celestial being, a spiritual entity revealed through visions, not a flesh and blood man he met for coffee. If you were to read only the letters of Paul, without knowing the Gospels, you might conclude that Jesus was an angel who was crucified in a lower celestial realm by demons, not by Romans in Jerusalem. Then come the Gospels: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These are the biographies we rely on, but historians tell us these were not written they were written anonymously. In Greek, not the Aramaic Jesus spoke, roughly 40 to 70 years after the events. That is a massive gap. It is like someone today writing a biography of Elvis Presley based solely on rumors they heard from their grandmother without ever having met the man or visited Memphis. The mythicists, proponents of the Christ myth theory, argue that during this 40-year gap, a game of telephone occurred. They suggest that early Christians were a mystery cult worshipping a Diandrazing savior god, similar to the cults of Osiris, Attis, or Myth. Over time, to make their god more relatable and to compete with other religions, they historicized him. They wrote allegorical fiction, placing their celestial hero in a specific time, the reign of Tiberius, and placed Judea. They argue that Jesus is a composite character, a mix of Jewish messianic prophecies, wandering cynic philosophy, and pagan solar mythology. They point out that he was born of a virgin like Perseus, had 12 disciples like the 12 signs of the zodiac, and rose from the dead like Osiris. Is it possible that the greatest story ever told is just that, a story? Is Jesus of Nazareth merely a Jewish version of King Arthur, a legendary figure based on loose traditions, but with no real historical footprint? To answer it, we cannot rely on the Bible. The Bible is the claim, not the evidence. We need to look outside the circle of believers. We need to find unbiased, hostile witnesses. We need to find someone who saw him. In the next episode, we will look at the silent century. We will examine the records of the historians who lived in the first century, men who documented everything from the weather to the price of grain, and ask the chilling question: why did any of them notice a man performing miracles and raising the dead? If a man walks on water, feeds 5,000 people with a single basket of food, and raises the dead in the middle of a crowded province, you would expect someone to notice. You would expect a letter, a diary entry, a government report, anything. The Roman Empire was not the Dark Ages. It was the height of bureaucratic efficiency. The Romans were obsessed with we have surviving tax receipts from Egypt. We have graffiti preserved in Pompeii about how much a loaf of bread cost. We have letters from soldiers complaining about the weather. We know the names of minor governors and the dates of insignificant battles. Yet, for the man who supposedly split history in two, the first century is deafeningly silent. This is the primary weapon of the mythicist argument. It is often called the argument from silence. They point out a disturbing fact. There were over 40 known historians, philosophers, and writers who lived during the time of Jesus, or immediately after his death. These were men who documented the reigns of emperors Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. These were men who wrote about Judean politics, Jewish sects, and strange religious phenomena. Not a single one of them mentions Jesus of Nazareth. Let us look at the most glaring omission. His name was Philo of Alexandria. Philo was a wealthy, educated Jewish philosopher who lived from 20 BC to 58. He was a contemporary of Jesus. He actually visited Jerusalem. He had family connections to the high priesthood. Even more importantly, Philo wrote extensively about the political situation in Judea. He wrote specifically about Pontius Pilate. He described Pilate as a cruel, stubborn man who agitated the Jewish population. If Jesus was a famous rabbi who debated the priests and was executed by Pilate during Passover, the busiest time of the year, Philo should have known. Philo would have used the crucifixion of a popular Jewish teacher as prime evidence of Pilate's cruelty. But Philo never mentions Jesus. He never mentions the crucifixion. To Philo, the events of the Gospels simply did not happen. Then there is Justus of Tiberias. He was a Jewish historian who lived in Galilee, the very region where Jesus supposedly performed his miracles. Justus wrote a history of the Jewish kings. Although his original work is lost, a Christian scholar named Phocius read it in the 9th century. Phocius was shocked. He wrote a note complaining that in the entire history written by Justus, there was absolutely no mention of the advent of Christ. A historian living in Jesus' own backyard did not think he was worth a single sentence. Consider the natural world. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke claim that when Jesus died, a great darkness covered the land for 3 hours. This would have been a massive astronomical event. Pliny the Elder was a Roman author who wrote a massive encyclopedia called Natural History. He recorded eclipses. He recorded strange weather patterns. He recorded earthquakes. Yet Pliny, writing just a few decades later, records no magical darkness. The sun stayed bright. The earth did not shake. Christian apologists, defenders of the faith, have a counter-argument for this silence. They argue that Jesus was a peasant. He was a nobody in the eyes of Rome. To the Roman elite, he was just another superstitious preacher in a dusty, rebellious province. Why would a wealthy philosopher like Seneca care about a carpenter from Nazareth? This argument makes sense, but it creates a major problem for the Bible. The Gospels do not describe Jesus as a nobody. They describe him as a sensation. Matthew says his fame went throughout all Syria. Luke says great multitudes followed him. John says the whole world had gone after him. So we are left with a contradiction. Either the Gospels are exaggerating his fame to a massive degree, or the historians of the first century were incompetent. The truth might be somewhere in the middle. Perhaps Jesus did exist. Perhaps he was a real man. But maybe he wasn't the superstar the Bible describes. Maybe he was a small, local disturbance. A man who preached, gathered a few dozen followers, and was executed quietly by a Roman prefect who signed the death warrant without even looking up from his paperwork. If he existed, he was invisible to the people who wrote history. It was only later, decades after his death, that his shadow began to grow. To find the first non-Christian mention of him, we have to fast. We have to leave the time of Jesus and enter the time of the Christians. We have to open the files of a Roman senator named Tacitus. And what he has to say is not flattering. If you grew up in the Western world, the story of Jesus feels unique. It feels singular. A God comes down to earth in human form. He is born of a virgin. He gathers 12 disciples. He performs miracles. He is executed by the authorities. He descends into the underworld. He rises from the dead after 3 days to offer salvation to mankind. It is a beautiful story, but to a historian of the ancient Mediterranean, it is not a unique story. It is a formula. This is the third pillar of the mythicist argument. They claim that the biography of Jesus is not history. It is plagiarism. They argued that the early Christians did not record the life of a Jewish rabbi. Instead, they constructed a new deity using the pagan blueprint. To understand this, we have to look at the religious marketplace of the first century. It was a time of syncretism. Cultures were blending. The Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Persians were all trading gods, like Pokemon cards. And the most popular trading card was the archetype of the Dianandrison god. Let us look at the god. Mithras was a Persian deity who became incredibly popular with Roman soldiers at the exact same time Christianity was starting to spread. The parallels are striking. Mithras was said to be born of a rock, which some interpret as a virgin birth. He was associated with the sun. His followers celebrated a sacred meal of bread and wine. He was often depicted with 12 signs of the zodiac surrounding him, similar to the 12 disciples. His birthday was celebrated on December 25th, the winter solstice, the rebirth of the sun. Then there is Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. He was the son of Zeus, god, and a mortal woman named Semele. He traveled around performing miracles. His most famous miracle was turning water into wine. He was called the only begotten Son and the Savior. He was torn to pieces and resurrected, but the most famous and controversial comparison is Horus from Egypt. Mythicists often point to the story of Horus and his mother, Isis. Isis was worshipped as the Queen of Heaven. She is often depicted holding the baby Horus in her lap-band image that looks identical to the later Christian iconography of Mary and Jesus. Horus had an enemy, Set, the god of darkness, who tried to kill him. Horus triumphed over death. Critics of the mythicist theory argue that these parallels are exaggerated. They say the details don't match perfectly. Mithras wasn't crucified. Dionysus was a god of madness, not peace. However, the early church fathers themselves noticed the problem. They didn't deny the similarities. They were terrified by them. Justin Martyr, a Christian apologist writing in the 2nd century, famously argued that these pagan myths were created by demons. He claimed that Satan knew the Messiah was coming, so he went back in time and planted these fake stories. Diabolical mimicry to confuse people when the real Jesus finally arrived. This is a fascinating admission. It means that even the earliest Christians recognized that their stories sounded suspiciously like the stories of their pagan neighbors. The mythicist conclusion is simple. The story of Jesus is an astro-theological allegory. The Son of God is actually the Son of God. The sun dies on the cross of the Southern Crux constellation during the winter solstice for 3 days, stopping its movement in the sky, before rising again on December 25th to bring light to the world. The 12 disciples are the 12 months or zodiac signs. They argue that Jesus was never a person. He was a solar deity that was historicized by a group of Jewish writers who wanted to create their own version of the popular mystery religions. They took the Jewish concept of a Messiah and wrapped it in the clothes of a pagan god. This theory explains why the contemporary historians were silent. They didn't write about Jesus because he was a myth happening in the minds of believers, not a man walking in Galilee. But this theory has a major weakness. If Jesus was just a copy of a pagan god, why did his followers choose such an embarrassing way for him to die? Pagan gods die in epic battles or cosmic tragedies. They don't get nailed to a piece of wood by a mid-level government bureaucrat. To Solbites, we need to leave the world of mythology and look at the cold, hard documents of the Roman Empire. We need to see if the Romans noticed this new cult. And it turns out, they did. In the next episode, we open the Roman files. We will read the words of a man who hated Christians, a man who wished they would all disappear, but who inadvertently provided one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Jesus was real. The silence of the 1st century is deafening. The parallels with pagan gods are suspicious. But the case for the mythicist theory hits a major roadblock when we enter the 2nd century. We finally get external confirmation, and it doesn't come from a friend of the movement. It comes from an enemy. Cornelius Tacitus is widely considered the greatest historian of the Roman Empire. He was not a Christian. He was a Roman senator, a proconsul of Asia, and a man who despised foreign superstitions. He wrote his final work, Annals, around 116 AD, about 85 years after the death of Jesus. In Book 15, Chapter 44, Tacitus describes the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The Emperor Nero was rumored to have started the fire himself to clear land for his new palace. To deflect the blame, Nero needed a scapegoat. Tacitus writes, "Therefore, to abolish the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians." This confirms that by 6 there was already a distinct group called Christians in Rome. But then, Tacitus drops the bombshell. He explains where the name comes from. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius, by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself. This single sentence is arguably the most important non-biblical reference to Jesus in existence. Tacitus confirms 3 crucial details that match the Gospels perfectly. Jesus existed. He calls him Christus. He was executed by Pontius Pilate. This happened during the reign of Tiberius. Critics of the passage argue that Tacitus was just repeating what Christians told him. They say he didn't check the official records. He just heard the rumors on the street. But this ignores who Tacitus was. He was a meticulous historian who had access to the Acta Senatus, the Senate records. He was obsessed with accuracy and hated rumors. It is highly unlikely that he would state a fact about a Roman execution without verifying it. Furthermore, his tone is completely hostile. He calls Christianity a pernicious superstition and a disease. If Jesus had been a myth or a solar deity, Tacitus would have mocked the Christians for worshipping a phantom. Instead, he treats Jesus as a real criminal who was executed by the state. Then there is Suetonius, another Roman historian and the personal secretary to Emperor Hadrian, writing around 121 AD. Suetonius describes the expulsion of Jews from Rome by Emperor Claudius in 49 AD. He writes, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christ, he expelled them from Rome. Christus is likely a misspelling of Christus Christ." This reference is more ambiguous. It suggests that Christ was physically present in Rome in 49 AD, causing riots. Most historians believe Suetonius was confused. He likely heard reports about Jews arguing over the Christ and assumed Christus was a living agitator in the city. But even this error confirms that the figure of Jesus was central to the Finally, we have Pliny the Younger, a governor in modern-day Turkey. In a letter to Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, he asks for advice on how to execute Christians. He notes that they sing hymns to Christ as to a god. This proves that by the early 2nd century, Jesus was already being worshipped as divine. The Roman evidence is not a smoking gun for the miracles. Tacitus does not say Jesus rose from the dead. He simply says he died. But for a historian, this is gold. It confirms the core historical claim. There was a man, he caused trouble, and Rome killed him. The mythicists have to work very hard to dismiss Tacitus. They have to claim the passage is a forgery inserted by Christian monks centuries later. But the style of the Latin is distinctly Tacitian cynical, sharp and complex. It is almost certainly authentic. So, we have a hostile witness placing Jesus at the scene of the crime. But there's another witness. A Jewish witness, a man who betrayed his own people to join the Romans, and who wrote the most famous history of the Jewish War. His testimony is the most controversial text in all of ancient history. In the court of historical opinion, the most damaging witness is not the enemy. It is the traitor. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish general who fought against Rome in the Great Revolt of 66 AD, when his army was defeated in Galilee. He defected to the Roman side, becoming a historian for the Emperor Vespasian. He wrote massive volumes on the history of the Jewish people, trying to explain their customs and beliefs to a Roman audience. Josephus is our primary source for first-century Judea. He mentions Pontius Pilate. He mentions John the Baptist. He mentions the high priests Annas and Caiaphas. He mentions the Zealots and the Pharisees. If anyone should have mentioned Jesus, it was Josephus, and in his work Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Chapter 3, he does. This passage is known as the Testimonium. It reads, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." This paragraph is a bombshell. It confirms everything: the miracles, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the title Christ. For centuries, Christian scholars pointed to this as proof undeniable. But there is a problem, a massive problem. Josephus was a proud Orthodox Jew. He believed in the law of Moses. He never converted to Christianity. He died a Jew. So why would a non-Christian Jew write? He was the Christ. Why would he write, if indeed one ought to call him a man, implying Jesus was divine? Why would he state as a fact that Jesus rose from the dead? If Josephus believed Jesus was the Messiah and rose from the dead, he would have been a Christian. He wasn't. This leads almost all modern historians, Christian and secular alike, conclude that the Testimonium Flavianum is, at least partially, a forgery. The theory is that sometime in the 4th century, a Christian scribe copying the manuscript decided Josephus wasn't enthusiastic enough. He inserted his own beliefs into the text to fix it. So, do we throw the whole thing out? Is the entire passage a fake? Most scholars say no. They argue that if you strip away the obvious Christian additions, he was the Christ. If indeed one ought to call him a man, he appeared to them restored to life. You are left with a very distinct, very Josephan core. The reconstructed text likely read something like this: "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." This version sounds exactly like Josephus. It is neutral. It calls Jesus a wise man, a term Josephus uses for other Jewish leaders. It calls his miracles surprising deeds, which can mean startling or troublesome. It notes that he was executed by Pilate on the advice of Jewish leaders, and it confirms that his followers were still around. Crucially, in another part of Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 9, Josephus mentions Jesus again, but this time in passing. He describes the execution of a man named James, and he identifies James as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. This second reference is widely considered authentic. It lacks the flowery theological language of the Testimonium. It simply uses Jesus as a marker to identify James. This is how historians identify people. James, the brother of John, or James, the son of Dan. If Jesus didn't exist, Josephus wouldn't use him as a reference point to identify someone else. So, while the famous Testimonium has been tampered with, the underlying evidence remains strong. Josephus, the traitor historian, knew who Jesus was. He knew he was a teacher. He knew he was executed. And he knew he had a brother named James. This simple, unemotional recognition is far more valuable to history than any forged confession of faith. It grounds Jesus not in mythology, but in the messy, violent reality of first-century politics. In the archives of the British Museum lies a manuscript written in Syriac dating back to the 7th century. But the text itself is much older. It is a copy of a letter written sometime in the late 1st or early 2nd century. The author is not a famous historian like Tacitus or a general like Josephus. He is a man named Mara bar Sarapion. We know very little about him, other than what the letter reveals. He was a Stoic philosopher from the city of Samosata in what is now Turkey. He was writing from prison. His homeland had been conquered by the Romans, and he was awaiting execution or perhaps perpetual exile. In his final days, he did what any good Stoic would do. He wrote a letter to his son, Serapion, offering him advice on how to live a virtuous life in an unjust world. The letter is a beautiful meditation on the fleeting nature of power and the enduring power of wisdom. Mara argues that wealth and strength can be taken away in an instant, as his own imprisonment proves, but wisdom is the only possession that cannot be stolen. To prove his point, Mara offers 3 historical examples. He lists 3 wise men who were unjustly executed by their own people. He writes, "What advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished." This paragraph is haunting. We know exactly who Socrates was. We know exactly who Pythagoras was. But who is the wise king of the Jews? Mara continues, "God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given." This is, without a doubt, a reference to Jesus of Nazareth. The parallels are too specific to ignore. Jesus was executed with a charged king of the Jews nailed to his cross. The timing Mara describes just after that their kingdom was abolished aligns perfectly with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which happened roughly 40 years after Jesus' death. To an outsider looking at the timeline, the execution of Jesus and the destruction of the Jewish nation would seem like cause and effect. What makes this evidence so compelling is its neutrality. Mara bar Serapion was not a Christian. He does not call Jesus Lord or Savior. He does not mention the resurrection. In fact, he implicitly denies the physical resurrection by saying Jesus lived on in the teaching which he had given, just as Socrates lived on in the works of Plato. To Mara, Jesus was not a god. He was a human philosopher. He was a martyr for truth, sitting in the same pantheon as the great Greek thinkers. The mythicists argue that Mara might be referring to someone else, perhaps the teacher of righteousness from the Dead Sea Scrolls, or perhaps the high priest Onius III, but neither of these men was called a king, and neither of them established a set of new laws that spread to the wider world. Jesus is the only candidate who fits the description of a wise teacher executed by Jewish authorities in Mara's view, whose death was followed by the diaspora and whose teachings were still famous enough in Syria for a pagan philosopher to cite them alongside Socrates. This document serves as a vital piece of the puzzle because it shows us how the educated elite of the Near East viewed Jesus before Christianity took over the empire. They didn't see a myth. They didn't see a solar deity. They saw a man of immense influence and wisdom, whose death was a tragedy that carried cosmic consequences. The letter of Mara bar Serapion is not proof of miracles. It is not proof of divinity, but it is powerful proof of historicity. It suggests that within a few decades of his death, Jesus was already recognized as a historical heavyweight, a man whose life and death were significant enough to be used as a moral lesson by a father trying to comfort his son from the darkness of a prison cell. With the external evidence from Rome, Judea, and Syria examined, the case for a historical figure seems strong. But the prosecution is not done. They argue that even if a man existed, the documents we rely on to know him, the letters of Paul and the Gospels, are hopelessly corrupted. They argue that the earliest Christian writings don't actually describe a human being at all. To address this, we must open the New Testament itself. We must start with the man who wrote half of it, yet never met Jesus in the flesh. We have spent the last few episodes looking outside the Bible. We have examined Roman historians, Jewish traders, and pagan philosophers. But now, we must turn our attention to the inside. We must look at the documents that actually started Christianity. And the first witness called to the stand is not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It is Paul. Most people assume the Gospels were written first. They weren't. The Gospels were written between 70 and 100 AD. The letters of Paul were written between 50 and 60 AD. The letters of Paul were written between 50 and 60 AD. If anyone knew the facts, it should be him. But when we read Paul, we encounter a strange and frustrating silence. This is the cornerstone of the mythicist case. They argue that Paul's letters do not describe a human being who walked the earth recently. They describe a celestial being. Paul never mentions Bethlehem. He never mentions Nazareth. He never mentions Mary or Joseph. He never mentions John the Baptist. He never mentions a single miracle Jesus performed. He never quotes a single parable. He never mentions the trial before Pilate. When Paul talks about Jesus, he talks about his death, his resurrection, and his future return. To Paul, the Christ is a cosmic agent of salvation who exists in the spiritual realm. Mythicists Slight, Earl Doherty, and Richard Carrier argue that for Paul, the crucifixion didn't happen on a hill outside Jerusalem. It's sapin in a sublunnar realm, a spiritual dimension where demons crucified the Savior. They argue that later Christians misunderstood Paul's spiritual allegory and wrote the Gospels as historical fiction to flesh out the story. This theory is compelling because silence is weird. Imagine writing a biography of Martin Luther King Jr. just 20 years after his death, but never mentioning I Have a Dream, never mentioning Selma, and never mentioning segregation. That is what Paul seems to do. However, historians argue there is a simpler explanation. Paul wasn't writing biographies. He was writing letters to solve specific problems in churches he had already founded. Paul didn't need to tell the Corinthians that Jesus was born in Judea because he had already told them that when he was there in person. You don't include a biography in an email to your coworker about a project. You assume they know the context. Furthermore, Paul does drop a few historical anchors that are devastating to the mythicist theory. In Galatians 4:4, Paul writes that Jesus was born of a woman, born under the law. This is a strange way to describe a celestial angel. Angels aren't born of women. They are created by God. Being born under the law places Jesus firmly in a Jewish context. In Romans 1:2-3, Paul states Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh. The Greek word used is sarx, flesh. It is physical, messy, biological stuff. It is hard to argue that a cosmic spirit has flesh and a specific human ancestry. But the smoking gun is in Galatians 1:19. Paul describes his visit to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. He writes, I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. This is the nail in the coffin for the pure mythicist theory. If Jesus was a myth, he couldn't have a biological brother. Paul doesn't call James a brother in the Lord, a spiritual title. He calls him the Lord's brother, a biological title. Josephus confirms this independently when he mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. So we have a convergence. Paul knew a guy named James. James was the brother of a guy named Jesus. Jesus was executed. The silence of Paul is real. But it is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of obsession. Paul wasn't interested in the human teacher who walked by the Sea of Galilee. He was interested in the divine Savior who appeared to him in a vision. He didn't care about the man. He cared about the meaning. But in his obsession, he accidentally let slip that there was, in fact, a man. Paul gives us the theology. But where do the stories come from? Where do the famous sayings like, turn the other cheek, and blessed are the poor originate? Most people think the Gospels are for independent eyewitness accounts. They are not. If you put Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, you will notice something suspicious. They copy each other. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a literary fact known as the synoptic problem. Scholars have proven that Mark was the first gospel written around 70 AD. Matthew and Luke came later, around 80 to 90 AD. We know this because Matthew and Luke contain almost the entire text of Mark, word for word. They used Mark as their narrative spine. But here is where the mystery deepens. There are about 200 verses that are found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. These include the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, the Golden Rule, and the parable of the lost sheep. If Matthew didn't get these from Mark, and Luke didn't get them from Mark, where did they get them? Did Luke copy Matthew? Unlikely, because they use the material in completely different orders. The solution proposed by scholars is that they both had a second source, a lost document, a collection of sayings that has vanished from history. German scholars in the 19th century called this Sourcequelle, which simply means source. Today, we call it Q. Q is a ghost book. We don't have a physical copy of it, but we can reconstruct it by looking at the overlap between Matthew and Luke. And when we reconstruct Q, a startling picture of Jesus emerges. The Q Jesus is very different from the Paul Jesus or the John Jesus. In Q, there is no birth story, no wise men, no shepherds. In Q, there is no narrative of the Passion, no Last Supper, no trial, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Q is almost entirely a list of wisdom, sayings, and apocalyptic warnings. It reads like a notebook of quotes from a traveling philosopher. Love your enemies. Judge not, lest ye be judged. The foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. This has massive implications for the existence of Jesus. The mythicists argue that Jesus started as a god and was later turned into a man. But Q suggests the exact opposite. The earliest layer of tradition remembers Jesus not as a Diandrazine savior, but as a teacher of wisdom. If Jesus was a myth invented based on pagan gods like Osiris, the first thing you would write down is the death and resurrection. That is the whole point of a pagan savior cult. But the author of Q didn't care about the death. He cared about the life. He cared about the ethics. This suggests that before the theology of the cross took over, there was a community of people who simply remembered what the man said. They wrote down his jokes, his insults to the Pharisees, and his advice on how to live. This points to a historical figure, a cynic-like sage, wandering the hill country of Galilee. A man whose charisma was based on his voice, not his divinity. The existence of Q forces us to confront a human Jesus that predates the divine Christ. It suggests that the supernatural elements were added later, layer by layer, onto the memory of a very real, very provocative teacher. So, if Q gives us the voice of the man, and Paul gives us the death of the man, we are starting to see a complete picture. But there is one more test we must apply. A forensic test used by historians to tell if a story is true or if it is propaganda. It is criterion of embarrassment. And it reveals that the Gospels are full of things the authors wished they didn't have to write. If you were inventing a superhero, you would make him perfect. You would give him a tragic backstory, a cool costume, and an unbreakable moral code. You certainly would unwrite a story where he gets beat up by a random thug in the first chapter, forgets his own powers in the second, and gets arrested for tax evasion in the third. Propaganda is about perfection. It is about smoothing over the rough edges. When North Korea writes a biography of Kim Jong-un, they claim he learned to drive at age 3. They don't mention that he failed a math test. This brings us to one of the most powerful tools in the historian's toolkit. It is called the criterion of embarrassment. The rule is simple. If a source mentions a detail that is embarrassing, awkward, or counterproductive to its own cause, that detail is likely true. Why? Because the author had no reason to invent it. In fact, they probably wished they could leave it out. When we apply this test to the Gospels, we find that the story of Jesus is full of things that the early Christians would never have invented if they were writing pure fiction. Exhibit A is the baptism. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew both state clearly that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. Today, we see this as a holy rite of passage. But in the first century, baptism was a ritual for the forgiveness of sins. It was a cleansing of filth. If Jesus was the sinless Son of God, why did he need to be washed? And more importantly, if John baptized Jesus, That implies John was the superior spiritual authority. The baptizer is always greater than the baptized. This was a PR nightmare for the early church. They were trying to argue that Jesus was God. Yet their own story had him submitting to a wild prophet in the desert. We can actually see the gospel writers struggling with this. In Matthew's version, John tries to stop Jesus, saying, "I need to be baptized by you. And do you come to me?" It is a clumsy attempt to fix the problem. If Jesus were a myth, the writers would have skipped the baptism entirely. They would have had Jesus descend from heaven fully formed. The fact that they kept the story even though it made Jesus look subordinate suggests that the baptism was a historical fact they could undeny. Everyone knew it happened, so they had to spin it. Exhibit B is the crucifixion itself. To a modern Christian, the cross is a symbol of victory. To a first-century Jew, it was a symbol of absolute failure. The book of Deuteronomy explicitly says, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." To a Roman, crucifixion was a slave's death. It was the most humiliating way to die imaginable. It involved being stripped naked, mocked, and left to rot for days while birds pecked at your eyes. If you were inventing a Messiah to overthrow Rome, you wouldn't have him executed by Rome. You would have him defeat the legions with a word. You would have him call down fire from heaven. Or at the very least, you would have him die a noble, philosophical, death-like Socrates drinking hemlock while surrounded by weeping friends. You certainly wouldn't have him scream, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and then die. The Apostle Paul admits this embarrassment. He writes that the cross is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. He knew it was a hard sell. The only reason to build a religion around a crucified criminal is if the man actually was crucified. You don't invent a loser hero. You spin a real tragedy into a spiritual victory. Exhibit C is the betrayal. The Gospels say Jesus was betrayed by Judas Iscariot, one of his own hand-picked disciples. This makes Jesus look like a terrible judge of character. Why would God choose a treasurer who was stealing from the money bag? Why would a divine being not know he was sleeping next to a snake? Again, if you were writing fiction, you would have the villain be a Roman soldier or a wicked priest. You wouldn't make the villain one of the hero's best friends. These awkward facts are the fingerprints of history. They show us that the gospel writers were not working with a blank slate. They were constrained by reality. They were stuck with a story they couldn't change, only interpret. But perhaps the most embarrassing fact of all is where he came from. The prophets said the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, but everyone knew this guy was from Nazareth. And Nazareth was a problem. In the search for the historical Jesus, the location is a tiny, insignificant hamlet in the hills of Galilee called Nazareth. For centuries, no one questioned the existence of Nazareth. It is right there in the name, Jesus of Nazareth. But in recent decades, a new argument has emerged from the mythicist camp, popularized by writers like René Saul. The argument is startlingly simple. Jesus could not have been from Nazareth because, in the first century, Nazareth did not exist. The skeptics point to the silence of the archives. The Old Testament lists dozens of towns in the tribal lands of Zebulun, but it never mentions Nazareth. The Talmud lists 63 Galilean towns. Nazareth is not one of them. Flavius Josephus, the Roman historian who commanded troops in Galilee and fortified nearby villages, mentions 45 cities in the region. He never mentions Nazareth. If the town is a fiction, then the man is a fiction. Mythicists argue that the name Jesus of Nazareth is actually a mistranslation of Jesus, the Nazarene title referring to a religious sect, the Nazarites, or a branch of Messianic thinking from the Hebrew netzer, meaning branch. Later gospel writers, they claim, misunderstood the title and invented a hometown to fit the name. This is a powerful argument, or it was, until the archaeologists started digging. In 2009, a team led by archaeologist Yardena Alexander made a discovery just yards from the Church of the Annunciation. They found a house, a simple courtyard-style dwelling, dating specifically to the early Roman period, Rogli 1a, 278. Inside, they found pottery shards, chalk vessels used only by observant Jews for ritual purity, and spinning whorls. Then, British archaeologist Ken Dark spent years examining the ruins beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. he found evidence of a first-century village that had been cut into the limestone hillside. The archaeological verdict is clear. Nazareth existed, but it was not a city. It was not even a town. It was a hamlet of perhaps 200 to 400 people. It was a collection of mud and stone huts clinging to a hillside, inhabited by conservative, poor Jewish farmers. It was a place so irrelevant that it didn't make the maps. It was the nowhere of Galilee. This physical reality actually strengthens the case for a historical Jesus. If early Christians were inventing a Messiah, Nazareth is the worst possible hometown they could have chosen. Prophecy demanded that the Messiah be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. Nazareth had zero theological value. In fact, it had negative value. In the Gospel of John, when the disciple Nathanael hears where Jesus is from, he scoffs. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? This captures the attitude of the time perfectly. Nazareth was a punchline. If Jesus were a myth, the writers would have simply had him be born and raised in Bethlehem. It solves all the problems. Instead, they had to perform narrative gymnastics. The Gospel of Luke invents a confusing census requirement to force Joseph and Mary to travel from their home in Nazareth to Bethlehem just for the birth, only to have them return to Nazareth immediately after. Matthew has them flee to Egypt and then settle in Nazareth to hide. These convoluted plot devices betray a struggle with historical fact. The writers were stuck with Nazareth. They couldn't get rid of it. Everyone knew Jesus was the guy from Nazareth. The fact that the gospel writers had to work so hard to explain away his hometown suggests that the hometown was a stubborn reality they couldn't ignore. The archaeology confirms the place, and the text confirms the embarrassment. If we accept that there was a man from Nazareth, the next question is dangerous. Who was he? The church says he was the Prince of Peace. The mythicists say he was a solar deity, but a growing number of historians, including Riza As, argue that he was something far more recognizable to the modern world. A terrorist, or, as they would have called him in the first century, a zealot. To understand this theory, we must look at the crime he was executed for. Crucifixion was not a punishment for heresy. It was not a punishment for blasphemy. The Jewish Sanhedrin stoned people for religious crimes. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, reserved for one specific crime: sedition, rebellion against the state. Hai, treason. When Jesus was nailed to the cross, the Romans placed a sign above his head. INRI, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Christians view this as theological irony. Historians view it as a legal statement. In the eyes of Roman law, claiming to be a king without the permission of Caesar was an act of war. The Zealot hypothesis argues that the real Jesus was a Jewish nationalist who wanted to overthrow the Roman occupation. The Gospels, written 40 years later, after the failed Jewish revolt of 66 AD, tried to scrub this clean. They tried to turn a violent revolutionary into a pacifist to ensure the survival of the church within the Roman Empire. But traces of the revolutionary remain. In Matthew 10:34, the Prince of Peace says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." In Luke 22, just hours before his arrest, Jesus tells his disciples to sell their cloaks and buy swords. When they tell him they have 2 swords, he says, "It is enough." Why does a spiritual teacher need swords? 2 swords aren't enough for an army, but they are enough for an assassination or a skirmish. Look at his inner circle. One of his disciples is explicitly named Simon the Zealot. Another, Judas, might bear a surname derived from Sicarii the Dagger Men, a group of Jewish assassins who murdered Roman sympathizers in crowds. Would a pacifist rabbi surround himself with known domestic terrorists? The most famous scene in the Gospels, the cleansing of the temple, is an act of violence. Jesus doesn't just preach against the money changers. He makes a whip of cords. He overturns tables. He shuts down the economic engine of Jerusalem. This wasn't a sermon. It was a direct attack on the high priests who were collaborating with Rome. This theory suggests that Jesus was caught in the Garden of Gethsemane, not because he was betrayed by a kiss, but because he was hiding out with an armed militia. When the Romans came, there was violence. The ear of the high priest's servant was cut off. This wasn't a peaceful surrender. It was a botched raid. So why do we have the image of gentle Jesus, meek and mild? because by the time the Gospels were written, Jerusalem had been destroyed. The Romans had crushed the Jewish rebellion. Being a Jewish Messiah was a death sentence. The Gospel writers, specifically Mark and Luke, writing for a Roman audience, had to depoliticize him. They invented the line, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's," to make him sound harmless. They blamed the Jews for his death and absolved Pilate, making the Roman governor look like a confused innocent. The zealot hypothesis solves the problem of why Rome killed him. Rome killed him because he was a threat. He was just one of many would-be kings who tried to liberate Judea and failed. The zealot theory explains the death, but it struggles to explain the teachings. If Jesus was just a warrior, why did he preach love your enemies? Why did he bless the poor? Enter the dominant theory in modern secular scholarship, championed by historians like Bart Ehrman and E.P. Sanders. The theory that explains both the man and the myth. Jesus was not a zealot, and he wasn't a god. He was an apocalyptic prophet. Apocalyptic in Greek means unveiling. In the first century, Jews were obsessed with the idea that the current age was evil, ruled by dark forces, and that God was about to intervene violently to destroy the wicked and establish a kingdom of heaven on earth. Jesus fits this profile perfectly. His message wasn't biased to each other. His message was, the kingdom of God is at hand. It was a countdown. When you read the Gospels through this lens, everything changes. Jesus wasn't giving advice for a stable society. He was giving survival instructions for the end of the world. He told people to sell all their possessions. Why? Because money would be worthless in the kingdom. He told people to leave their families and let the dead bury their own dead. Why? Because there was no time for funerals. He told people not to marry. Why? Because the world was ending. This explains the urgency in his voice. In Mark 9:1, he makes a specific prediction. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. In Matthew 24:34, he says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." This is the most uncomfortable fact for Christian theology, but the most convincing fact for history. Jesus was wrong. The generation passed away. The kingdom did not come. The Romans were not destroyed by fire from heaven. Instead, the Romans destroyed the temple. If Jesus were a myth created by the early church, they would never have put a failed prophecy in his mouth. They would have edited out the timeline. They would have made his predictions vague. The fact that the Gospels preserve these errors suggests they preserve the actual words of a man who genuinely believed he was living in the last days. This theory also explains his death. Jesus went to Jerusalem for Passover not to die for the sins of the world, but to trigger the apocalypse. He believed that by confronting the high priest and cleansing the temple, he would force God's hand. He thought the Son of Man would descend on the clouds to save him from his enemies. This leads to the most heartbreaking moment in the Bible. On the cross, Jesus cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" Theologians try to explain this away as Jesus quoting a song, but historically it reads like the devastation of a man who realizes, in his final breath, that he was mistaken. The angels were not coming. The kingdom was not starting. He was just a man dying on a stick. The apocalyptic prophet theory gives us a fully human Jesus, a man of immense charisma and deep moral insight, but a man who was ultimately a product of his time. He was a visionary who saw a better world coming, but he miscalculated when it would arrive. And it was this tragic failure that forced his followers to reinvent him. When the kingdom didn't come to earth, they had to move the kingdom to heaven. We have examined the silence of historians. We have analyzed the pagan parallels. We have looked at the embarrassment of the Gospels. But in any investigation into whether a person existed, the strongest evidence is usually their family. You can invent a superhero. You can invent a god. You can even invent a whole timeline of events. But it is very, very difficult to invent a brother who is walking around, leading meetings, and arguing with people in the real world. This is the single biggest obstacle for the mythicist theory. If Jesus was a celestial being who was crucified in a sublunar realm by demons, or if he was a solar allegory for the zodiac, then he cannot have biological siblings. Yet, the historical record is adamant. Jesus had a brother. His name was James. We first meet James in the letters of Paul. As we discussed earlier, Paul is the earliest Christian writer. In his letter to the Galatians 1:19, Paul describes his first visit to Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion. He writes, "I saw none of the other apostles, except James, the Lord's brother." Mythicists, like Richard Carrier, argue that the Greek word for brother, adelphos, can mean spiritual brother. They claim that all Christians called each other brother, so Paul was just using a title of respect. James, the brother in the Lord. But this argument collapses when you look at how Paul writes. In 1 Corinthians 9-5, Paul is defending his rights as an apostle. He asks, "Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Here, Paul creates 3 distinct groups: the apostles, the brothers of the Lord. Cephas Peter. If brother just meant Christian, this sentence would make no sense. It would read, as do the other Christians and the Christians of the Lord and Peter. Paul is clearly distinguishing between the inner circle Peter, the white missionaries apostles, and a specific biological group, Jesus' kin. Furthermore, we have independent corroboration from outside the Bible. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian we met in episode 5, records the execution of a man in Jerusalem in 62 AD. He identifies the victim as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. Josephus was not a Christian. He didn't call people brother in a spiritual sense. He was using a standard identifier. In a world without surnames, you were identified by your father or your brother. James was famous enough that Josephus used him to mark a moment in history. The existence of James anchors Jesus in reality. It forces us to deal with a messy human dynamic. The Gospels paint a picture of a family that was deeply divided. In Mark 3:21, Jesus' family hears about his preaching and sets out to seize him, saying, "He is out of his mind." In John 7-5, it explicitly states, "For even his brothers did not believe in him." This is the criterion of embarrassment again. If you were inventing a Messiah, you would make his family his biggest supporters. You wouldn't write a story where his own brother thinks he is crazy. The fact that James later became the leader of the Jerusalem church after Jesus died suggests a profound transformation, likely triggered by a vision of the risen Jesus, which Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15. But the most telling detail about James is his theology. James was known as James the Just. He was a strict, conservative Jew who spent so much time kneeling in prayer that his knees became calloused like a camel's. He insisted that followers of Jesus should still follow the law of Moses. He fought with Paul, who wanted to abandon the law for Gentiles. This conflict is historical gold. It shows that the early Jesus movement wasn't a unified myth. It was a fractured, arguing family business. On one side, you had Paul, the innovator. On the other side, you had James, the conservative brother. If Jesus were a myth, this conflict is inexplicable. Why would Paul fight for authority against a spiritual brother of a metaphor? Paul fought James because James had the ultimate trump card. James knew Jesus. He grew up with him. He ate with him. He knew what Jesus actually said, versus what Paul thought Jesus said. The existence of James serves as a hard stop for the mythicist theory. You can argue about miracles. You can argue about the resurrection. But you cannot argue away the man who ran the Jerusalem church for 30 years and was executed by the high priest Ananias for being the brother of a troublemaker. James is the thread that, when pulled, brings the entire Jesus myth unraveling down to earth. History is full of failed messiahs. In the century before and after Jesus, there were dozens of men who claimed to be the king of the Jews. There was Judas, the Galilean. There was Theudas. There was Simon Bar Kokhba. They all promised to defeat Rome. They all gathered followers, and they were all killed by the Romans. In every single case, when the leader died, the movement died. The followers went home. They realized they had bet on the wrong horse. But with Jesus of Nazareth, something different happened. When he was executed, his movement didn't scatter. ETH exploded. Within a few weeks, His followers were back in Jerusalem, the very city where he was killed, preaching that he was alive. The mythicists argue that the resurrection is a copy of pagan myths like Osiris or Dionysus, but historians argue that something much more human was happening. Something psychological. The earliest accounts of the resurrection in Paul's letters do not describe an empty tomb. Paul never mentions a tomb. He simply says that Jesus appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to 500 brothers at once, and finally to Paul himself. The Greek word Paul uses is ophtho, which means was seen. It implies a spiritual vision, not necessarily a physical body walking out of a grave. Modern psychology offers a compelling explanation called bereavement hallucination. It is a well-documented phenomenon where grieving people vividly see or hear a loved one who has recently died. In a high-pressure, apocalyptic cult where emotions are running high, one person's vision can trigger a chain reaction. Peter, crushed by guilt for denying Jesus, sees a vision of his master forgiving him. He tells the others. The power of suggestion takes over. This is known as cognitive dissonance. When a prophecy fails, Jesus died instead of bringing the kingdom. The believers have two choices: admit they were wrong, or double down and invent a new explanation. The disciples chose the latter. They reinterpreted the death not as a defeat, but as part of the plan. But the Gospels add a physical detail that is harder to explain away. The empty tomb. Mark, the first Gospel, ends with 3 women finding the stone rolled away, and a young man telling them, Jesus is gone. The women flee in terror and tell no one. Many historians are skeptical of the tomb story. Romans typically left crucifixion victims on the cross to rot as a warning, or threw them into mass graves for criminals. They rarely allowed honorable burial in a private tomb. However, if the tomb story was invented, it contains a fascinating, embarrassing fact. The first witnesses were women. In first-century Judea, a woman's testimony was not valid in court. If you were inventing a story to prove your leader was alive, you would have Peter or John find the tomb. You wouldn't trust the most important moment in history to Mary Magdalene. The fact that the Gospels say it was women suggests that, historically, it really was women who found something. Maybe a wrong tomb, maybe an empty grave, or maybe they just found the courage to speak first. Whether the tomb was empty or not, the belief in the resurrection is a historical fact. It is the singularity that created Christianity. Without that belief, Jesus would have just been another forgotten Jewish rebel. But because they believed, they turned a tragedy into a theology. How did a Jewish peasant from a distinct backwater town become the creator of the universe? It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, controversial process that took centuries. If you read the New Testament in chronological order, you can actually watch Jesus evolve. In the earliest writings, Paul's letters, c. 50 AD, Jesus is an exalted figure, a son of God who was raised from the dead. But Paul never explicitly calls him Yahweh. He is the agent of God, distinct from God the Father. Then we get the Gospel of Mark c. 70 AD. In Mark, Jesus is a human being. He is adopted by God at his baptism. When he comes out of the water, a voice says, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." This is called adoptionist Christology. Jesus wasn't born God. He earned it. In Mark, Jesus suffers. He doesn't know everything. He admits he doesn't know when the end will come. He can't perform miracles in Nazareth because of their lack of faith. He is powerful, but he is not. Oh, then comes Matthew and Luke c. 80-90 at. They aren't satisfied with adoption. They want him to be God from the start, so they add the virgin birth. Now, Jesus is divine from conception, but he is still distinct from the Father. Finally, we get the Gospel of John c. 9100 Atrio direito. This is the high Christola. John begins not with a birth, but with the creation of the universe. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In John, Jesus is a cosmic superhero. He never doubts. He never suffers in silence. He controls his own death. He says things that historical Jesus almost certainly never said. Like before Abraham was, I am. The mythicists argue that this evolution proves he was always a myth. But historians argue the opposite. The evolution proves he was a man. If Jesus started as a god, a myth, the stories would have been consistent from the beginning. He would have been a consistent deity. The fact that the story grows adding miracles, adding divinity, scrubbing away human limitations shows that there was a kernel of historical reality that was slowly being covered in layers of golden paint. The early church fought bitterly over this. The Ebionites believed Jesus was just a man, a great prophet, but human. The early church fought bitterly over this. The Ebionites believed Jesus was just a man, a great prophet, but human. The Gnostics believed he was a divine spark, trapped in matter. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, 300 years after his death, that the Roman Empire officially decided who Jesus was. Emperor Constantine needed a unified religion for a unified empire. The bishops voted. They decided that Jesus was of the same substance as Tefater, fully God and fully man. The heretics were burned. The books that disagreed were destroyed, and the human Jewish prophet was lost to history, replaced by the Pantocrator, the ruler of all. But if we dig through the layers of theology, if we chip away the gold paint of Nicaea and the high poetry of John, we can still catch a glimpse of the man underneath. A man who got angry, a man who got hungry, a man who didn't know the future, but was willing to die for it. We have examined the evidence. We have looked at the silence of the first century. We have analyzed the pagan. We have read the Roman death warrants and the Jewish histories. We have dissected the embarrassing failures in the Gospels and the family feud between Paul and James. So, did Jesus really exist? In history, we rarely deal with 100% certainty. We deal with probability. We cannot prove that Alexander the Great existed in a laboratory. We rely on documents. The probability that Jesus was a pure mythosaur deity invented by a secret cult is extremely low. The mythicist theory requires a massive conspiracy. It requires us to believe that a group of Jews invented a Messiah who failed, was crucified, invented a hometown that was mocked Nazareth, and invented a brother who actually lived and led the church, James. It requires us to believe that Josephus, Tacitus, and Marabar Serapion were all fooled or forged. The probability that Jesus was a historical figure is extremely high. The minimal facts accepted by virtually every scholar at every major university, from Oxford to Yale, regardless of their religious belief, are these. 1. Jesus was a Jewish teacher in Galilee. 2. He had a brother named James. 3. He was baptized by John the Baptist. 4. He preached an apocalyptic message about the kingdom of God. 5. He caused a disturbance at the temple. 6. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate around 30 to 33 AD. Everything else, the water into wine, the walking on water, the resurrection, is a matter of faith, not history. But the man himself, he was real. He was likely a poor, charismatic, and intense figure. He was not a white man with blue eyes and long flowing hair. He was a Middle Eastern Jew with dark skin and rough hands. He didn't speak the King James English. He spoke Aramaic. He wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew. He didn't come to start a new religion. He came to reform his own. The irony is that the historical Jesus is often more interesting than the religious Jesus. The man we found in this investigation is a radical. He stood up to the greatest empire the world had ever known, with nothing but his words. He challenged the religious corruption of his day. He championed the poor and the outcast, and he paid the ultimate price for it. Whether you believe he was the Son of God or just a son of a carpenter, his impact is undeniable. A man who never wrote a book, never held an office, and never commanded an army is today the most famous figure in human history. Perhaps the question, did Jesus exist, is the wrong question. The real question is, why do we still care? We care because his story is the ultimate human archetype, the story of a light in the darkness, the story of suffering and redemption, the story that says even if the empire kills you, the truth cannot be buried. The man is gone. His bones are likely dust in an unmarked grave outside Jerusalem. But the movement he started, whether by miracle or by the sheer force of human belief, still shaping the world today. And in that sense, he never really died. This concludes our cold case investigation into the most controversial figure in history. We've stripped away the theology to find the man, and we've examined the arguments that say he was never there at all. Now, I want to turn the verdict over to you. Based on the evidence we presented, from the Roman files of Tacitus to the lost Q source, where do you stand? Do you believe Jesus was a real historical figure, or is the Christ myth theory the ultimate truth that history has been hiding? This is a safe space for debate, so leave your verdict in the comments below. I'll be down there reading the best arguments for both sides. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's greatest mysteries, please smash that like button. It helps us fund more investigations just like this one. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next case file. We're currently voting on our next documentary series. Should we investigate the lost city of Atlantis? Or dive into the dark history of the CIA? Let us know what you want to see next in the comments. Until then, keep questioning history.